There has never been a relationship between a president of the United States and a television network in the way that Donald Trump has one with Fox News. So says the host of CNN's Reliable Sources, Brian Stelter, who chronicles this unprecedented and, he says, deeply concerning relationship for democracy in a new book. It's called Hoax: Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth. And Brian Stelter joins us now from Manhattan Island in New York City. It's good to meet you finally. I'm a big fan of your show. I love the book, and I was also disturbed as hell by the book. How's that for an opening? Nice to meet you, Brian.
I can put that blurb on the back of the book.
For what it's worth. I'm sure that'll sell you 2 copies. Let's start with this. Should we make the distinction between, say, the morning show guys and the primetime hosts and the news division of Fox, which thinks it covers the news pretty straight up?
Yes, there is still a difference, but the difference is becoming blurrier and blurrier. The distinction is being lost. It's as if they had a brick wall between news and opinion, and the wall has been taken down brick by brick in the Trump years. President Trump doesn't want news on Fox. He wants propaganda on Fox. And increasingly, that is what he's getting.
Well, you say his #1 chief propagandist is a guy by the name of Sean Hannity, who is, I guess he's the big anchor of the primetime lineup. And you tell us they speak, the president and the talk show host speak virtually every day. What in heaven's name do they talk about?
Yeah, you want to find collusion in the Trump years. Here is the real collusion between Fox and Trump. Hannity and Trump are personal friends. They talk about their families. They talk about their lives, their grievances. But they also exchange talking points and themes and ideas for future shows. And in the case of Hannity, he's also pushing for Trump to hire certain people or fire certain people. This is a back and forth relationship that turns Hannity, a television host, really an entertainer, into a shadow chief of staff. And I argue in Hoax, you can't understand the Trump years, and you certainly can't get beyond the Trump years without understanding Fox's role. Because it's really Fox that sets the agenda for Trump. It's Hannity that sets the agenda for Trump.
Now, on the one hand, I'm a little jealous of a guy who's got direct access to the top decision maker in the whole country. I'd love the Prime Minister of Canada to take my calls every day. So, on that hand, what's wrong with it?
Well, I'm glad that Trudeau is not every single day getting misinformed by television channels he watches. That's really at the heart of this problem. Trump is misinformed by what he hears on Fox. And then he goes on Twitter and shares that mis and disinformation with the rest of the world. That's the real poison at the heart of the story. I wouldn't have written this book if the president was getting really excellent, high-quality journalism from Fox every day. I wish he was, but he's not.
What does Hannity genuinely, behind the scenes, think of Donald Trump?
Well, that was one of the biggest surprises for me in this reporting, because Hannity is such a sycophant on air, such a supporter no matter what, such a cheerleader for Trump no matter what. But behind the scenes, he has the same experience of Trump that so many former Trump advisors and officials have described. I'm talking about the John Boltons of the world, who say that Trump is a run-on sentence, that he has crazy ideas. Friends and associates of Hannity said to me, he says Trump is crazy. He knows Trump is crazy. He describes Trump as a run-on sentence. At one point, Hannity was vaping a lot early in the Trump years, and he said, "You'd be vaping too if you knew what I was hearing." So there's a kind of stress that comes from being this unofficial advisor to Trump. There's a stress that comes from having to promote him on TV every day. But Hannity never admits it on TV, and there's a hypocrisy to that.
If this is an unhealthy relationship, I would assume that Fox management oversees it and puts its 2 cents worth in from time to time with their most expensive host. Does that happen?
That's what should happen. That's certainly what would happen at any other network. But the real story of Fox in the Trump years is a lack of leadership. Frankly, I think in some ways this is a business school case study about what goes wrong when a company is making a huge amount of money, $2 billion in profits a year, but then doesn't have a clear, strong, firm leader to set a tone and set an agenda and say, yes, that's appropriate, no, that's inappropriate. It's as if Hannity runs his own show and there's nobody holding him accountable.
Well, let's take a look at the coverage of COVID-19. For example, Fox Television, many of the hosts, certainly in the primetime lineup, and even some of the news as well, was saying, look, this is not that big a deal. This is, again, 6 months ago. This is not that big a deal. Nothing to see here. Move right along. What were they actually doing at Fox headquarters while they were broadcasting that to the nation?
Well, this is what's so disturbing about Fox's coverage of the pandemic. On the air, they were downplaying the disease. But off the air, the place smelled like Lysol. You know, they were making all the same precautions that CNN was taking, that you were taking, that everybody was taking. They were putting the hand sanitizer stations in place. They were starting to think about what the rules about masks would be. They were telling staffers to work from home. But on the air, the message was different. And I think fundamentally that was the problem with Fox's handling of the pandemic. Both Trump and Fox were always 2 or 3 steps behind where they needed to be. And you know, we'll never know what the cost in human lives and suffering is. Certainly, there's a lot of blame to go around in the United States for all the failures of the pandemic. But Fox was the biggest channel, and Trump, of course, had the biggest platform of all.
Now, it's not as if nobody inside Fox was raising the flag on this, and I'm going to read a quote from your book here. On March 20th, 2018, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters wrote a scathing memo to colleagues calling Fox a propaganda machine for a destructive and ethically ruinous administration. He said he was ashamed to work there and he quit, dynamiting the bridge on his way out. Fox isn't immoral, it's amoral, he concluded. The network's merger with Trump was opportunistic. Okay, that's nothing mealy-mouthed about that memo, but what impact did it have?
I think it's incredible to hear someone who worked at Fox for years say that publicly. That doesn't happen in television. It never happens. I mean, no one's ever left CNN and said the place is amoral. And I mean, he's basically almost saying the channel's evil. It's really a remarkable thing. He is one of many former Fox staffers who have those concerns, but Peters actually shared it publicly. Others usually only share it in private. But what was the result? Really nothing. Nothing changed internally, nothing changed externally. Fox has lost a lot of talent in the past few years because there's a lot of people there who don't feel like they fit in anymore in the Trump years. They don't want to be part of the propaganda. But there are still plenty of people who are happy to wave the Trump flag 24/7.
Now, we Canadians, of course, sharing a very long border with you, get all of your channels, and we do watch them.
Right.
But I suspect people have, well, I certainly didn't, and I'm in the business. People have no clue how much these people make. What do the primetime hosts get paid?
Yes, this is a different stratosphere from most people in television. But at Fox News, Sean Hannity is making $35–40 million a year between his television and radio shows. Tucker Carlson makes $10 million a year. Brett Baer makes about $12 million. Some of this is depending on how many years they've been there. Some of this depends on how highly rated their shows are, or whether they threatened to leave in the past and had other offers from other networks. But these figures are, you know, they're off the charts. And the reason is these hosts have a stranglehold on the audience. Sean Hannity has 4 to 5 million viewers a night. There are many nights in the United States where that's the highest rated show on all of cable, not just news, but I'm talking about sports, entertainment. He's bigger than all of them. And that's because there's such a loyal audience that feels alienated by other news in the United States. They've been told for decades, Republicans have been told for decades not to trust the mainstream news media, and Hannity benefits from that.
What conclusion did you come to as to whether or not they really believe everything that they're saying, or they just understand that it's in their financial self-interest to tie their wagon so tightly to Trump?
Right. You know, this is at the heart of the Fox story, and I don't know exactly how to answer it, to be honest with you, because some people do believe some of it, right? Sean Hannity, for example, he wants GOP policy victories. He wants conservatives on the Supreme Court. Many of Fox's morning stars and primetime stars support a Republican policy agenda. Where I think they struggle to support Trump in private is with this indefensible, reckless behavior. Look at him coming home from Walter Reed, right? Every week it's something new, some reckless, dangerous behavior by the president. And that's harder to defend, but they find ways to do it. Don't worry about these stars. They find ways to do it. They'll either change the subject, they'll make excuses, they'll say the Democrats are worse. That's really what Fox is at the heart. It's an anti-Democrat channel.
Well, let me ask you about another personality that maybe some of our viewers will know, Maria Bartiromo, who was really she was a pretty good business reporter, I remember, when she was on her previous channel. She's now completely in the tank for Trump. What happened there?
Yes. Yeah, I think this proves the incentive structures at Fox are all wrong. The incentive structures are not to report the news straight and try to get to tell a true story of what's happening in the Trump White House, all the scandals and controversies and mistakes and all that. The incentives instead are to appeal to a slavishly pro-Trump audience that doesn't want to hear bad news about the dear leader. And Bartiromo, she chases the ratings. She sees the ratings every day. She tries to do the same thing tomorrow. and hold on to that audience. Look, I care about ratings too. I work at CNN. I see the ratings, but there's not that same obsession with appealing to the audience at all costs. I think that's the difference at Fox.
We've talked about some big names, but I want you to talk to us now about just sort of the average producer, the average researcher, the average reporter who works at Fox News, and whether they are disturbed that they, from time to time, work in a news division that seems to actively falsify empirically provable facts. How do they feel about that?
Yes, and there are reporters who have left as a result. There's a dozen examples in my book of people who looked around and said, I can't stay here anymore. I don't fit in here anymore. Whether it was having to defend the family separation policy, kids being broken off from their parents at the U.S. southern border, whether it's the Charlottesville and the president's reaction to those racists in Virginia. People looked around and said, I can't take it anymore. But a lot of producers and staffers do stay, whether for the money, whether for the power, whether because they're not sure they have other options, they're afraid they wouldn't get a job somewhere else, and also because Fox feels like a family. It's an us versus them dynamic. People think, well, I'm on one team, I can't leave to go to the arch rival team. There's a lot of that going on. It's an example of how U.S. politics has become so broken and polarized, so us versus them. And sadly, it's easier to be against something than for something, and that's the Fox model.
Well, if you work for Fox News, are you almost ipso facto seen as tainted by MSNBC or CNN or any of the other channels for that matter?
That's what NBC executives said to me. They said, we get a lot of resumes from folks at Fox, but we view Fox as a different kind of company. We view it as a lifestyle brand.
What's a more accurate way to characterize the relationship between the Fox News division and the president? He tells them what to report, or they tell him what to say?
I think it is Fox that is setting the agenda more often. They are telling him what to say. And I had producers of the morning show called Fox and Friends who said that to me over and over again. They said, people think he gives us talking points. Hell no, we give him talking points. We tell him what to say. Now, of course, this producer was bragging, but there's a lot of truth to it. I see it happen almost every morning. Even when the president was at the hospital, even when he was in his hospital room, he was tweeting Fox and Friends quotes. That's the morning show. He was tweeting what he was hearing on Fox News and taking his cues from the morning show. And that's disturbing because this is not the highest quality content on American TV. This is lowbrow stuff. This is cheap stuff. They're taking talking points from right-wing websites and they're just talking about them. They're not doing original reporting. So that's really what's broken about this relationship between Trump and Fox.
Well, let me play devil's advocate and go on to the other side. There might have been planes in the air over Iran dropping bombs, if not for Tucker Carlson. True?
Yeah, isn't that an incredible story? That's the thing. This is a very complicated relationship because different stars at Fox have different relationships with the president. So Tucker Carlson, who is very much a dove, he is against American escalations in foreign countries. He had the president's ear at that pivotal time. Iran had shot down a U.S. drone. Tucker was on the air loudly urging Trump not to retaliate, not to take action. And there was a day, back in June of 2019, when the president said planes were locked and loaded. We were about to retaliate. And he was thinking about Tucker Carlson. Trump even called Tucker to get advice from Carlson. And ultimately that strike was called off. It is an amazing thing to think about that a television star can have that much influence.
Does Tucker admit that it was his comments to the president that ultimately carried the day?
No, and he's careful about this. There were certainly other factors involved that day. There was a general on Fox who made some influential comments as well. But Tucker Carlson does appreciate his power. He has 4 to 5 million viewers watching. He uses his program to advance an anti-immigration agenda. Many of his colleagues think he's promoting a white nationalist agenda. Of course, Tucker always denies that. But there is a lot of white identity politicking going on Fox. It's a largely white channel with a white Christian conservative audience that expresses this fear of multiculturalism, this resistance to a changing America. And that's going to be around regardless whether Trump wins or loses. I think that's what's important to know about Fox. This brand, this channel is so powerful whether or not Trump wins or loses the election.
Let me raise another name here. People may remember a fellow by the name of Anthony Scaramucci, who was a friend of Trump's back in New York and then was the director of communications in the White House for about a week and a half. And you've got him quoted in the book as saying, "What I can't understand is why good people are willing to be accomplices to this nightmare." What do you think the answer to that is?
If you believe that this is a nightmare in America, I think this shows that voters who supported Trump, they made choices that were not about his personality. They were not about what he was saying or what he was tweeting. It was about something much deeper in America, a resistance to a woman running for president, resistance to diversity in the country. Clearly, racial resentment was a factor. Economic struggles were a factor. And so, you know, all of the noise that surrounds Trump, all of the controversies and scandals, all of the wheeling and dealing and the tweeting, a lot of his voters tune it out. And I think we have to recognize that. And you can see that in the Fox coverage, by the way. You know, Fox does not, they don't focus on the same scandals and controversies that the rest of the news media does. They make excuses and they change the subject to the Democrats. And it's much more about what Joe Biden is doing wrong versus what Trump might be doing right or wrong.
Well, I do notice every now and then that a host is able to push back. And I do remember Neil Cavuto going on the air and saying, "It's not fake news, Mr. President, that's your problem, it's you." Now, how did he get away with saying that?
I mean, those are important moments because Fox is a critical messaging vehicle for the president. He needs to hear the truth on Fox. They need to speak truth to power. And Neil Cavuto does it, Chris Wallace does it, Brett Baier occasionally does it. But there's not many other people I can list off and say they are speaking truth to power. Cavuto does it because he's been there forever. He's been there for a very long time. He feels very confident on his show. But there's a lot of people at Fox who said to me anonymously, "I don't feel I have power to speak up. I don't feel I have power to fact check the president," for example. So Cavuto is one of those exceptions.
Well, the other one, of course, was Shepard Smith, who did the afternoon run and was quite critical of Trump when he wanted to be and when he felt the facts backed him up. What happened to him ultimately?
Yeah, look, Shep, I remember Shep on Election Day 2016 criticizing Trump for lying about voter fraud. Trump, on the day of the election, was suggesting the election was rigged because he thought he was going to lose. So he was setting up a storyline for why he lost. And Shep called him out that day, and Shep called him out for 3 years on. But Shep couldn't take it anymore either. He quit in 2019. He felt that he could not stay at a place where Tucker Carlson and others were making fun of him on the air. You know, that kind of rivalries inside the network, those were a real problem. And because there isn't a strong leader at Fox, Tucker was allowed to get away with it. So Shep quit. He went off to a new network, CNBC. He launched a new show. And you know, that sadly is what's happened again and again. As Fox has become Trumpier and Trumpier and Trumpier, real journalists have looked and headed to the exits.
Shep was one of the very few openly gay people on that channel as well. Now that he's gone, is that demographic spoken for at all?
That's an interesting point. You know, he, for example, one of Shep's many complaints about Fox was that the network has an on-air commentator, Robert Jeffress, who has made anti-LGBT comments in the past, anti-gay comments in the past. And Shep was bothered that nobody else at Fox seemed to be bothered by that. So, you know, he does leave a void in many ways. You know, when you're at a television network or a news outlet, you want a lot of people with a lot of different points of view, a lot of different backgrounds, you know, and to the extent that Fox has become Trumpier and Trumpier, they've lost some of that.
Let's do another quote from the book here. You write, "The word hoax was uttered more than 900 times on Fox News in the first 6 months of 2020. Every time Trump tweeted it or Hannity shouted it, a little bit more truth was chipped away from America's foundation, precisely at a time when the country was beset by multiple crises and needed honesty and accuracy, compassion, and sound science." Let's pursue that for a moment or two here. How does the relationship between the president and this television channel ultimately, in your view, put democracy at risk?
Well, this is fundamentally what's broken in America, this idea that everything could be fake news, that everything could be a hoax. I hate that word hoax. I use it for the title of my book because it's such a nasty little word. It's so malicious. You know, it means that I'm trying to hurt you if I'm trying to pull a hoax on you. But Trump uses the word every day, almost every day. Fox uses it even more often. They go back and forth. They echo each other. And it's had real consequences for democracy. We don't have a common ground for facts and understanding of what's going on. By all means, we should fight about policy choices, but let's agree on the facts first and then fight over the choices. And we can't do that anymore in the country because this fake news hoax rhetoric has been so poisonous. I had a staffer at Fox say to me, Trump and Fox's alliance puts democracy at risk. And look, we're going to see what happens this fall, right? We're going to see what happens on election night. If the other networks say it's too early to call the election, but Fox comes out and says they think Trump has won, that's going to be deeply destabilizing. Now, I do not think that will happen, because I think the people at Fox who make election projections are very trustworthy people. But there's a different problem as well. What if Sean Hannity and Trump and Laura Ingraham and all these Trump promoters at Fox, what if they claim the election was rigged, even if Fox's news division says it was not? That could create a real crisis for the country.
Well, I remember, I think I well remember, George W. Bush's second election victory, and there was actually a fight on the air election night as Karl Rove and Megyn Kelly, the anchor, had a disagreement about the status of the election at that point. Rove saying, wait a second, this can't be true. And Megyn Kelly saying, well, let's go into the back room and we'll talk to the people who have those numbers. Does that kind of tension exist anymore?
Yeah, I loved that transparency where Megyn Kelly showed the audience how the decisions are actually made. This is about science and data, not about political agendas. Does that still exist? Yes, that same team that calls the elections does still exist. And I've spoken with people at CNN who say, we trust our colleagues at Fox who actually make those decisions about the elections. But it's more, my concern is about the propagandists on Fox, Trump's friends on Fox, who might try to promote a different narrative. And ultimately, I think that's part of what's so wrong at Fox in the Trump age. They always give Trump the benefit of the doubt, even though he has lied to the country tens of thousands of times. They still take his word seriously. They still assume he's telling the truth. And that's a foolish thing, right? Like, fool me once, shame on you, but like, fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me 20,000 times, that's a lot of shame on me.
I think there are a number of Canadians who take a little bit of pride in the fact that it's a guy from Toronto who's actually been counting all these lies up. Daniel Dale, formerly of the Toronto Star, who's on your channel all the time.
Daniel Dale, a national treasure. And it's so revealing. Think about what happened with Daniel Dale, right? Of the Toronto Star. CNN grabbed him up because we so desperately needed a fact checker full time. Fox never hired a fact checker in the Trump years. And I think that's kind of revealing about Fox's position. They're not as interested in knowing what is true and what is not true. They're more interested in a political agenda, a political narrative. But thankfully, the other networks, I think, have done a better job of trying to figure out what is true in the Trump years. And as Daniel Dale often points out, Trump says the same lies over and over again. So it's not that hard to unpack some of what he's saying. He tells really simple stories that are appealing to his base, but are not appealing to the rest of the country.
Brian, we obviously, as we sit here, don't know who's going to win the election. It certainly looks good for Biden, but you can't say that just yet. But I presume at the highest levels of Fox News, they are having conversations about how they will reinterpret their mission if Trump loses and if Biden wins. Can you let us in on what's probably going on in those conversations?
Yeah, in the Obama years, Fox called itself the voice of the opposition, meaning the opposition to Obama. And the same thing is already becoming true at Fox. They're already more focused on Biden, trying to take Biden down and scrutinizing every word he says. I think what Fox does with Kamala Harris will be especially notable, a woman of color. Certainly there are a lot of Fox viewers who have very strong and very negative feelings about seeing a woman of color in a powerful position. So, it's interesting about Fox. It's kind of like heads they win, tails they win. They win either way in terms of ratings and profit. They win when a Republican is in office, and then they win when there's a Democrat in office because they're against the Democrat. That just speaks to how polarized the media climate is in the United States, how broken it is. But I don't want to get into this claim that both sides are equally bad. MSNBC, liberal news outlets, they don't engage in the same kind of propaganda for a Democrat that Fox engages in for a Republican. Fox is a unique animal. I guess it's an animal if it's a fox, a unique animal in American life. And it has to be understood, I think, as something bigger than a television network. For its fans, it's an identity. It's almost a way of life. And I think, in order to address it, make it better, respond to it, you have to understand its power.
Well, let's finish up on this. The people, I would suggest, who really should read your book are precisely the people who, upon hearing about your book, will say, there they go again, to quote Ronald Reagan, there's that fake news again. I mean, presumably that as an author who's put a lot of time and effort into writing a book and who's spoken to, I think you had, 100 sources or more for this book, I mean, that's a bit depressing, isn't it? That the people who you think really ought to read it and need to read it won't read it.
It is distressing, but I believe that on a one-to-one basis, we can build bridges and make connections. I remember going to a Trump rally in 2018. CNN made me have a bodyguard with me, which really speaks to the poisonous environment we are in. I didn't actually have any safety concerns, but it was nice to have someone watching my back just in case. And as a result, I was able just to have really honest, relaxed conversations with Trump fans. And most of them, they didn't want to call me names. Sure, a few of them did, but most just wanted to take selfies. Most just wanted to talk to me and ask me questions. It reminds me that when we get past the name calling and insults and all that nonsense, we actually can still have conversations, but unfortunately, that doesn't scale, right? I can't be at every Trump rally. I can't try to talk to every Fox viewer one-on-one. Ultimately, any attempt to improve and reduce the polarization and the crazy flames and fire and warring of the time, it's only going to happen individually, right? Friend to friend, family member to family member.
Well, we are very grateful on TVO tonight for this conversation with the author of Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth. Brian Stelter, we enjoy you on Reliable Sources, and we're grateful you came onto our channel tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.